There are places in Burkina Faso where the wind catches torn plastic bags and carries them across empty fields. For years, they have clung to fences, filled ditches, and gathered in the streams where children once played. Some saw only waste. Others saw a nation abandoned by those who promised progress. But today, something extraordinary is happening. Under the leadership of Ibrahim Traoré, what was once trash is being reborn not simply as bricks or tiles, but as schools, roads, and pathways for the next generation. The plastic litter that once suffocated our land is now being transformed into the very material on which our children will walk to class. The waste that once blocked our waterways will soon hold up the walls of community centers and public homes. This is not just recycling. This is restoration. This is dignity reclaimed. This is a nation declaring that nothing about its future will be thrown away again. If you believe that a people can rise by transforming what they were once told to discard, stay with this story. For years, the streets and open fields of Burkina Faso have carried the burden of a growing environmental crisis. Plastic bags drift across dry grasslands, bottles pile along the edges of markets, and fragments of broken containers settle into the soil. These are not just signs of pollution. They are symbols of a global imbalance where some nations consume without restraint, and others are left to bear the consequences. In neighborhoods across Ouagadougou, families burn plastic waste simply because there is no other option. The smoke hangs in the air, thick and toxic, settling into the lungs of the young and the old alike. In the rivers that once nourished crops and livestock, microplastics now flow silently carried downstream into the very land that feeds the nation. Children walk past waste on their way to school, learning too early that their environment has been neglected by forces far beyond their control. But leadership does not accept the world as it is. Leadership imagines the world as it could be. When President Ibrahim Traoré addressed this challenge, he did not speak in the language of resignation. He spoke with conviction of renewal, of sovereignty, of rebuilding from within. And he stated clearly, "We will not trade our resources to Western corporations in exchange for them to process our waste. We will transform it into homes for our own people." This is more than a policy position. It is a shift in identity. It is a nation looking at what was once dismissed as worthless and choosing to shape it into the foundation of its own future. The initiative to transform plastic waste into building materials for schools, public roads, and community spaces is not merely a recycling effort. It is a declaration that Burkina Faso will not be defined by what others discard. It will be defined by what it chooses to build. And gradually, the world is beginning to notice. International coverage from regional outlets to Africa news platforms no longer talks about Burkina Faso only in the context of conflict or hardship. They speak of innovation, of dignity, of a nation taking control of its narrative. But to understand the full power of this transformation, we must look at how this initiative is reshaping the lives of the people themselves. The true turning point of this initiative did not happen in a government office. It happened in the streets. When the first teams of young people began gathering plastic waste from markets, bus stations, and riverbanks, something changed. What was once a symbol of neglect became a source of purpose. The same hands that once struggled to find work were now shaping the materials that would build schools and pave new roads. And for the first time in a long time, many felt they were building for themselves, not for foreign companies, not for distant investors, but for their own communities. The process was simple in appearance, yet profound in meaning. Plastic waste was collected, sorted, washed, and processed into durable building units. But the deeper transformation was happening in the hearts of the people. Young men and women who had been told for years that they had no opportunities now stood in factories, workshops, and community yards with pride. They were no longer witnesses to the decay of their environment. They were the ones reversing it. The reaction across Burkina Faso was immediate and emotionally charged. In villages and city neighborhoods, elders spoke of the project as a return of dignity. Parents began to say, "Our children are building the future with their own hands." National morale did not rise through speeches alone. It rose through work, through creation, through visible proof that change was possible. And the world began watching. As the project expanded, something remarkable happened beyond the borders of Burkina Faso. News outlets across the continent began to take notice. Headlines in Africa News labeled it the Reconstruction Movement, a national rebuilding effort, driven not by foreign aid, but by the people themselves. Commentators from across the region described it as a model of self-determination, a practical expression of dignity reclaimed. But transformation does not come without resistance. Foreign corporations, particularly those who had long profited from exporting resources and importing cheap goods, began to ask questions. Why was Burkina Faso no longer selling raw materials? Why was the nation choosing to manufacture its own future? Why was a country that was once seen as dependent now asserting control over its economic destiny? The answer was simple and it was firm. Burkina Faso belongs to its people, not to those who exploit what they think is weak. Public support grew even stronger. Mothers saw cleaner streets. Farmers saw soil returning to life. Teachers saw new classrooms being prepared for children who had never studied in a proper building before. The pride was not abstract. It was visible, physical, built layer by layer like the bricks themselves. And at the center of this shift was a single idea. A nation is not rebuilt through permission. It is rebuilt through conviction and action. The world was no longer just observing Burkina Faso, it was learning from it. The transformation sparked by this initiative was not limited to the economy or the environment. It began reshaping the social fabric of Burkina Faso itself. For decades, many communities felt that development was something that happened to them, not something they shaped. Roads were built by foreign contractors. Schools were funded by NGOs with changing priorities. Public works often came with strings attached, cultural expectations, political concessions, or debt that weighed heavily on future generations. But now the conversation changed. When bricks made from recycled plastic began forming the foundations of local schools, the community didn't just see buildings, they saw themselves in the walls. Every block represented hours of labor cooperation and intention. The sense of ownership was profound. People no longer said, "The government built this." They said, "We built this." Neighborhood associations organized cleanups not out of obligation, but out of pride. Teachers explained to students how their classrooms came from recycled waste. Children understood that they were quite literally learning inside a symbol of rebirth. This is how national identity quietly reshapes itself, not with slogans, but with experience. Politically, the initiative strengthened Ibrahim Traoré's message of self-determination. He had long urged the people of Burkina Faso to believe that liberation does not require permission. Now there was evidence, tangible, visible, permanent, that his words were not just rhetoric. They were a roadmap, and the people were walking it. The initiative also shifted the balance of power between the government, global corporations, and international institutions. Before, development funding often came tied to conditions that prioritized foreign interests. Loans demanded austerity. Grants required ideological alignment. The narrative was always the same: progress must be imported. But here was proof that progress could be constructed internally without dependency. This strengthened the government's negotiating position on the global stage. When Burkina Faso demonstrated that it could create infrastructure from its own resources, even from what others considered waste, it undermined long-standing assumptions about which nations were producers and which were consumers. It challenged the idea that Africa must always receive solutions rather than generate them. International observers took notice. Some praised the innovation. Others viewed it with concern. Because a nation that can build its own roads and schools is a nation that can refuse unfavorable deals. A nation that can create value from discarded material is a nation that cannot be easily manipulated by scarcity. Civil society felt this shift deeply. Workers, youth organizers, mothers, cooperatives each found in this initiative a renewed sense of agency. It reintroduced a truth that colonization and dependency had tried to erase. A nation is strongest when its people are the architects of their own future. And from here, the impact expanded outward, influencing the region, inspiring movements, and attracting global attention. Outside observers, particularly in the United States and Europe, reacted with a mixture of admiration and uneasy curiosity. Sustainability organizations praised the project as a model of circular economy, at its most authentic, not corporate green branding, but community-led ecological restoration. Environmental scientists noted that Burkina Faso was addressing not only pollution, but the deeper crisis of resource sovereignty. However, Western industry analysts viewed the shift differently. For decades, African nations have been positioned as endpoints destinations for exported waste, raw resource extraction, or markets for processed goods. When Burkina Faso demonstrated the ability to repurpose waste into durable construction materials, it challenged the logic of these systems. If a nation can build using what it already has, why import, why depend, why accept unequal terms? This is where the initiative intersects with geopolitics. The United States, positioned as a leader in innovation, was now confronted with the reality that innovation is not exclusive to wealthier nations. In think tank discussions and policy papers, analysts described Burkina Faso as a microcosm of rising self-sufficiency movements across Africa. If one nation succeeds, others may follow. If others follow, supply chains change. Influence shifts. The balance moves. And suddenly, Africa is not merely a region in the news. It is a force capable of redefining the future on its own terms. Global South countries began reaching out: Senegal, Rwanda, Mali, Ghana, requesting technical exchanges, research collaboration, and shared training programs. What began as a single national initiative started evolving into a continental conversation. Meanwhile, global media outlets including Africa News, Al Jazeera, Africa, and independent journalists shifted the narrative. Instead of focusing on conflict or instability, they highlighted resilience, ingenuity, and self-directed growth. The story of Burkina Faso became a counterweight to decades of reductive portrayals of Africa in Western media. Yet what truly captured global attention was not the technology itself. Similar recycling methods had existed elsewhere. What was different was the meaning behind it. In Burkina Faso, recycled plastic was not just turned into construction material. It was turned into pathways for children to walk safely to school, public squares where communities gather, roads connecting rural farmers to markets, walls of clinics that would one day save lives. This was not infrastructure. This was identity expressed through creation. The world was reminded of something fundamental. Innovation is not born from abundance. It is born from necessity, pride, and purpose. And that is why the story could not be ignored. The unexpected turning point came when researchers from international engineering institutes traveled to Burkina Faso to study the materials being produced. Their conclusion was astonishing. The recycled composite bricks and tiles were stronger, more weather-resistant, and more affordable than many conventional building materials used globally. This discovery changed everything. Suddenly, Burkina Faso was not just a participant in sustainable development, it was a leader. The narrative inverted. Experts from abroad were not coming to give advice. They were coming to learn. Western media outlets that once dismissed Burkina Faso as peripheral began to change tone. Headlines shifted from skepticism to respect. What was once considered a poor nation struggling against the odds was now seen as a center of innovation, and quietly among the people something profound took root: confidence. The belief that nothing is beyond reach, that what others call waste can become the foundation of a future, that a nation once underestimated can rise through its own ingenuity. The deeper twist, however, was cultural. As young people worked together collecting, sorting, and producing building materials, they began to rediscover community. Village bonds strengthened. Urban youth, once frustrated and restless, now found purpose in collaboration. Elder generations, who once feared that traditions were fading, saw values of shared responsibility return to life. This was more than environmental restoration. It was social restoration. The discarded plastic had represented something more painful, the feeling of being forgotten by the world. But now that same plastic was being shaped into classrooms, roads, and gathering places that united the nation. The message became clear. Burkina Faso is rebuilding itself not from wealth, not from imports, but from identity. And in this, Ibrahim Traoré emerged not just as a president, but as the symbol of a generation reclaiming destiny. The story of Burkina Faso's transformation is not one of miracles. It is one of effort, conviction, and faith in one's own people. Where others saw waste, the people saw potential. Where others saw limitation, the nation saw foundation. From plastic once scattered across the land, a new landscape has risen of schools, of roads, of opportunity. Children now walk to classrooms built from materials their own communities created. Families gather in public spaces once overwhelmed by waste, now renewed with purpose. And across the country, the message is clear. We did not wait for salvation. We built it. As Ibrahim Traoré has said, we will not request permission to be free. We rise and we build. If this story resonates with you, if you believe that dignity can be rebuilt, that nations can reclaim their future, and that Africa is rising not through charity, but through strength, share this story. Subscribe to follow this journey, because the rebirth of a nation is not a moment. It is a movement.